welcome everybody to the fifth Autism and Systemic Practice Conference 2025. You're most welcome. We're thrilled to have you along. There are 200 people registered. We've got some great presentations coming up for people. And Monica, we wanted to introduce the organizing group.
Yes, we did. And we have a very dedicated organizing group. I suppose for the last year and a half, nearly 2 years, isn't it, Gail, since the last one? We've been working diligently. So we have David, Gail, people will wave as we go along, Dawn, who is busily doing the CPD stuff, Mary, Fran Urbistino Cano, Grace Bosworth, Karen Partridge, and Xander. And all of us have been working at various different stages. People can drop in and drop out, but I think the main thing is I suppose all of us systemic therapists, all of us really passionate about working with and learning from autistic people and trying to improve services, and particularly systemic family therapy services for families and individuals who are living with autism or may identify themselves as autistic. And I suppose that's part of our culture of the conference as well, that we look at how people identify themselves is a personal choice. And particularly that we kind of honor all those choices in people joining into the conference. So some people will identify as autistic, some people will identify as having autism, or living with autism, and those choices are theirs alone. But I think what I'm most excited about is that the conference is open to everybody, family members, therapists who may be autistic or neurodivergent, students also, that we welcome a lot of students because the future of our field is hugely important for us, that people have a chance to listen to all of the speakers and join in, so that we can learn from one another. So,
And this event started David Steer, one of the organizing groups, and I were around in nearly said 1914, but actually I didn't mean 1914, though it sometimes maybe feels like that. 2014, when we had the first systemic practice and autism interest group, and then we were joined by other people who came to do doctoral research in the field of autism and learning disabilities, learning challenges. And we set up this conference, first in person, then online. And it's been an important conference, politically, really, because the history of theorizing and designing services for people who are autistic has been very much created from an outsider perspective, sort of professionals as experts, professionals who are not like that. They are, in quotes, normal, meaning, whatever, but that I'm using it very much in quotes to kind of say that there was a separateness, a way of theorizing about others. And that's part of a kind of colonial inheritance and colonial practice, that some people think they know better, sort of a supremacist idea, really. I'm more superior than you are. I know better than you. So this is very important for us to look at in all our professional histories, including the systemic community, but particularly mental health services, who have created categories of people who've then been ascribed to diagnostic categories and treated as patients, as people who are less capable of knowing about their own lives, as people who are certainly not capable of theorizing themselves and their own communities. And we've seen that with people who are neurodiverse, with queer people, with people who are, whether they're trans or gay or both or whatever. And and these categories often try to tell single stories. So one of the interests we have in this conference is on intersectionality, that people are more than a single story, they're more than just autistic. And one of the problems is that these diagnostic categories and these labels, which are very useful in some instances, people speak about them being very important and very useful, sometimes restrict what people see in each other. So if people want some help about something, their autism may get foregrounded and it might be the only thing people see. And they may be at risk of not seeing other context, other layers of identity, which may be quite impactful. So issues to do with race, to do with gender, to do with sexual orientation, sexuality, age, and so on, might be invisible filters that professionals are not recognizing are in play for them or others in people's worlds. So these are very interesting and important matters for us to consider in this conference. And for some reason, systemic practitioners often don't see themselves as having a role to play. So one of the in helping, working with, being alongside people who are autistic, neurodiverse, however people are wanting to describe themselves, and increasingly, of course, people are saying, "I'm not simply autistic. I've got my own unique neurodiverse makeup." And maybe everybody's neurodiverse. Well, of course, everybody's neurodiverse, but in what ways and how is society learning, open, and responsive to uh, everybody's individual needs? So these are some of our preoccupations. Should we say something about the conference program, Monica, before we?
Yeah, I think the conference program, the two-day program will follow kind of a similar format in that we have kind of sessions each day where we have a speaker. So for example, this morning we have Mairi Evans, and then sorry, I'm just pulling it up on my thing. Um, so we have Mairi Evans this morning. Then we'll have a break. So the format for the speakers is kind of similar for everybody. We will have a speaker who will have time to speak for themselves. Then we will go straight into breakout rooms, which is kind of an unusual move for us. But I think it also gives the speaker a little break, and so that people will be able to discuss straight away their thoughts and comments. And then we will come back into the larger room and we will host the responses with the speaker there as well. At 11 a.m. we'll have our first break. And we unusually in this conference we have kind of hosted tea breaks. So members of the committee will host a tea break and host our lunch breaks as well. So that means if you want to go and get a sandwich and have a cup of tea and come back and chat with people, that is there for you. And the same with our lunch break. David and Grace are hosting our lunch break today. And then in the afternoon, we'll have a check-in, and then we have Luke Bearden in the afternoon. And David will be hosting that. And then also later on in the afternoon, from 3 to 4:30, we'll have a systemic therapy community where we will discuss some of our feedback on the day. And also, most importantly, we'll have three short presentations. So between 11:30 and 12:30, we'll have three kind of short presentations that will be have been submitted for the conference. And these are really to give people a forum to talk about different aspects as well. And then in the final part of the afternoon, we will have a close for the day and a whole group discussion. But the program is up on the Eventbrite and you should have received it this morning. We encourage people to dip in and dip out. If you feel comfortable and you have to kind of go and do something, please do come back to us. if you don't want to be seen, as Gail says, turn off your camera. We will be recording a lot of the program. We won't record the forum in the afternoon, but we will be recording other parts of the program, and we're recording at the moment. Um, and particularly if you have feedback, you can put it into the chat also, and we'll be monitoring the chat. We encourage people to look after your safety as well, because we will be talking about autism, we'll be talking about diagnosis, we'll be talking about families' journeys, we'll be talking about things that may be uncomfortable and triggering for some people. So we would encourage people to mind yourself during the day as well. Um, because again, we never know what's going to trigger us. It could be a piece of language, it could be somebody says something or looks in a certain way or calls back something to memory. So again, just those safety kind of things of being safe and minding yourself on the conference is important to us as well. Because we will have family members, we will have um, or people whose diagnosis is very recent. We will have people who may not identify, or think people may be triggered very easily by some of the things in the conference. And that's important to say, I think, Gail.
I'm sure there's some things we could have said, should have said, forgot to say.
Mhm.
But just to repeat a welcome to everybody, it's fantastic to have this shared space, this opportunity. So please make yourself comfortable. As Monica was saying, keep yourself safe and look after yourself during this time as well. Always feel free to, if you want, have your camera on or off, lie down, go and get a cup of tea, whatever you need. And also, just to say, we'll put a link in the chat. The recordings will be available on the Systemic Practice YouTube channel, which is hosted by Everything is Connected Press, which is a systemic publishing tent, and publishes Murmurations. And also, just to extend an invitation to you all, we're going to be, after the conferences, we tend to publish a special issue in Murmurations Journal of Transformative Systemic Practice, which you can find, by the way, at murmurations.cloud. Maybe somebody will put it in the chat in a minute. And we've had 2 special issues, and we're curating a third at the moment. We invite interesting papers, politicized papers, community attuned papers. We're not interested in dull, dry research reports, though they're useful, but that's just not what we publish. We're interested in people's lived experience as members of the public and as professionals. So if you look at murmurations.cloud, and we'll post a link later, you'll see there's a call for papers. We invite any of you to have a look at what we are asking for, inviting, and see if you feel there's something you would like to offer. And if you would like a chat about that, email us as well. So without further ado, I'm going to spotlight you, Mary. Mary, how nice to see you.
And you? Hi.
Are you okay? You said you're a little under the weather.
Yeah, I've got a virus, so if I'm a bit croaky and I have to stop and have a drink of water every so often, I apologise. But other than that, I'm good, thank you. So it's
It's
great to
great to
be
have you
here.
here. I mean, you and I have known each other for quite a while now, and I'm very happy to have this position of introducing you. It's really interesting when you're a doctoral research supervisor. What happens is you start off by thinking you're offering learning to somebody else, and doctoral researchers think I'm going to get learning from my supervisor, but things shift, things change, and your doctoral researcher, the person you're maybe offering research supervision to, as I was with Mary, actually becomes, of course, much more knowledgeable because they are studying things in real time, and developing not only awareness of what's going on in their own specialist area, but they're creating new knowledge. And so it's been an absolute joy to work alongside Mary and learn from her um, and read your papers and learn from your papers. So I feel very humbled having had the kind of contacts, but we've co-written things. There was a great chapter that you played a very important part of for the Handbook of Systemic and Family Therapy that came out a couple of years ago. Massive handbook, wasn't it?
Yeah, huge.
Like with 5 million chapters in it. Well, let's say at least 100. And we were in our chapter was with Fran Obistondo Cano, Sarah Helps, and Ingrid Flam was in uh, I can't remember which of the volumes, but anyway, it's a good chapter. And if anybody wants to read a copy of it, I'm sure there's a way of making it available um, in the chat today or some other route. But also, Mary, we'll try and put up some links to some other papers. Like I'm thinking of your autism paper. Now, pause there in your visual memory, people, because Mary wrote a paper on autism called spelt OUGHTism and talked about the implicit compulsorynesses that of people's experience, particularly of mothers, what mothers of autistic children are expected to be like, do, feel, respond in certain ways. And it was a really brilliant systemic contextual reframe of how people are impacted by context. And the context might be a narrative one of what people are and aren't allowed to do, expected to do. But it was a very good spotlight onto the experiences of parents. And of course, your doctoral research was very much around gender and the oversight of the diagnosis of autism in girls and the impact on mothers of the lack of diagnosis, the ignorance, and lack of attention to parents, particularly mothers of autistic children. You draw a lot on your own lived experience. And maybe you'll say a bit about that in your own introduction of yourself. But you're a great writer, and I really encourage people to read Mary's papers because they're very accessible. They're really nice, nicely written. And you've been part of this organizing group for years, except you've been elevated to presenter now. So the rest of us have been doing some organizing, and you've got a sort of going to have a recording frame around you, and that's very special for us. And thank you for coming and presenting at this conference today. So, Mary, you're talking about neuro-informed not knowing and relational curiosity. I'm very interested to hear more about that because curiosity is a well-used systemic term and it doesn't mean nosiness. Well, I'm saying that you might have a different framing and we're going to hear about that, but it's a well-used term and I don't think people often think about what that means. So I'm very interested in how you put the word relational in front of it. And also not knowing is a well-known, commonly used systemic term that we should stay open. We shouldn't be looking through prefigured lenses at what we're expecting to see, because guess what? We'll find it. So this neuro-informed not knowing, I'm really ready to hear about. So Mary, without any further ado, thank you again for coming and presenting, sharing your ideas with us. And I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself. Are you going to share your slides? Or
Yeah, I can share my slides.
okay,
That's
let
fine.
me just
Thank you.
see if you need my permission to share your slides.
I think it's doable now. I think it's set up and doable.
Okay,
So
that's good.
it's been done.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, what a lovely introduction. I feel like I'm not going to live up to it now. But thank you, Gail. And thank you so much for all the support you've given me over the years. Because I mean, what an experience. I suppose if anybody is here now thinking, should I explore a systemic doctorate or not, I'd say absolutely go for it. It was one of the best things I've done. I really enjoyed it, and it was just such a great opportunity, really. So I'll leave that with people. Yeah, I have got a virus today. I'm not 100%, so I'm a bit wobbly, but that's fine. We're all like that sometimes, aren't we? But I'm just sort of putting that out there at the beginning. And I think what I'm sharing today, it connects to this being the 5th conference, really, because I presented at the first conference, which, as Gail said, was face-to-face. And then that was just before I studied my doctorate. And the conferences, as they've gone along, have kind of been my journey as I was studying. And now I'm at the other end, and I feel like I've gone full circle in a way. And some of the things that I thought about at the beginning, before my doctorate, I'm back to thinking about now as a systemic therapist. And that's very much as there's no one right way to work with autistic people. And I think it's so important that we hold on to that, and that everybody that comes into the room to meet you is unique. And I suppose that's what I want to talk about today. It's, how can we know enough about autism that we can still see people's uniqueness and connect with their uniqueness. And I'm also thinking about what Gail was saying about people think they know better. It's what can you know in order not to think you know better? And I think that's a little bit of what I'm sharing today. So it's kind of a scrapbook of ideas. It might be a bit messy, so go along with me, and hopefully everyone will just take away at least 1 or 2 things from it, really. So I'm going to start sharing. Hopefully this is going to work. Right, so I think I'm screen sharing, so hopefully people can see that. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up or something to say that? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, and as Gail said, I've called this neuro-informed not knowing and relational curiosity. I'm smiling to myself. We're systemic therapists. We've always got to come up with some wordy kind of title, haven't we, really? So the plan is to look a little bit at not knowing. And as Gail said, some of these really fundamental systemic theories, and I wanted to revisit systemic theory with autism as a lens and neurodivergence as a lens. So I thought what it might help to know in order not to know. What do we need to know in order to kind of sit back and really be curious? I touch on neuroillusion, diagnosis and the diagnostic double bind, and then some thoughts for practice. And Gail mentioned autism, so if there's time I'll revisit autism for those of you who maybe don't know so much about that. So, as Pierce said, we live in lives filled with meaning, and one of our life challenges is to manage those meanings so that we can make our worlds coherent and live with our social lives with kind of honour and respect. And I was thinking about the different parts of me that I bring to this presentation, really, a number of which Gail's sort of touched on already. I'm neurodivergent, I'm autistic, I'm the mother of 2 neurodivergent children, but there's no singular diagnosis in our family. My husband's got MS, my children have got a number of different sort of neurodivergences, I've got a number of neurodivergences. So, we're just a patchwork of things, aren't we, as human beings? And I think if you just see one label or diagnosis and think that's what that person is, you're missing so many other things about them, really. I grew up as the mother, as a child of a mother with cerebral palsy. My mum always taught me about the ability and disability, and I'm really thankful to her for that as well. Yes, I did my doctorate. My doctorate was exploring autism diagnosis and the experience of mothers of girls. And for me, that was really important because it was about hearing people's stories and making sure their stories are heard. And that's something I've tried to continue doing post research, really, is to keep those voices being heard. I'm a systemic family therapist. My experience is across CAMS, adult mental health, neurodiversity services, and I've also got a social work background, so I've got that grounding in child protection and social care. And in my day job, I'm a clinical director within the NHS across a number of different children's services as well. So, and you know, I'm a member of a book group, and I do this, that, and the other. We're all so many different things, aren't we? And we bring that when we come to talks like this or anything in our lives, really. So I'm going right back to 1988, and you know, things I learned in my systemic training, and I was thinking about the idea about the client being the expert, and Anderson and Gulishan's talking about not knowing. So they spoke and they said to not know is not to have an unfounded or unexperienced judgment, but it refers more widely to the set of assumptions and the meanings that the therapist brings to the clinical interview. The excitement, and I love the idea of the excitement for the therapist is in learning the uniqueness of each individual's client's narrative truth, the coherent truths in their lived stories. And therapists are always prejudiced by their experience, but they must listen in such a way that their pre-experience does not close them up to the full meaning of the client's descriptions of their experience. And that can only happen if the therapist approaches each clinical experience from the position of not knowing. So that's each time is the first time. Each time is unique. And to do otherwise is to search for regularities and common meaning that may validate the therapist's theory, but invalidate the uniqueness of the client's stories and thus their very identity. So 1988, a long time ago, but still really, really relevant and really pertinent for therapeutic practice now. So I was just hoping people might put a few things in the chat. Just thinking about what I've just said, so considering Anderson and Gulishan's comments, how do you think this relates to the way in which people approach working with autistic or other neurodivergent people and their families? I'm hoping somebody's going to pop something in the chat there. How do you think that relates to how we work with autistic people and their families? I'm going to go back to the slide before so you can see it to comment. I'm checking you're all engaged and awake here. Okay, brilliant. So not being organised by the diagnosis. Someone said they can be a prejudgment. Okay, but someone has also said 90% of my autistic clients show up with very similar issues, which is important to hold in mind as well. Not to assume that one method works in the same way for all autistic people. Yeah, absolutely. Careful to challenge medical model deficit assumptions. Yeah. Okay, so lots of helpful thoughts. And then about exploring curiously with the person. And yeah, David's put down that's the bit I was saying, when you've met one person with autism, yeah. And someone's put, can sometimes judge people's experience and difficulties in the lens of their autism. Yeah, so that's kind of given as the answer, isn't it? Thank you. Thank you, that's really helpful. Okay. So, some of what I thought would be helpful today, and this is where I've sort of said it's a scrapbook of ideas really, was thinking about things it might help to know so that you can consider not to know. Because if we go in with a completely lack of knowledge around autism or neurodivergence, there's a risk that we will bring other preconceived ideas and we won't fully understand somebody. But if we come with too much of a fixed idea about autism and neurodivergence, equally we won't be curious about other things. So there is this sort of neuro illusion really about what autism is and what autism looks like, and I've put some kind of stereotypical kind of pictures here really. So the idea about autism and learning disabilities, we know some people are autistic and have learning disabilities, but not all autistic people have learning disabilities. So there's still some understanding from some people that that's what autism will look like, although it's changing over time. The idea of like Rain Man and the savant skills. So, if you're autistic, you're going to have, an extreme interest in something and you're going to be brilliant at it and you're going to have this kind of expert skill. The idea that it's kind of something you'd be able to see that someone's autistic in the way they're behaving. And those old stereotypes around, boys lining up cars and stuff like that. I was reminded of it. I was on the plane last week, probably why I've got a virus, to be fair. I was on a plane last week and I was sat in a row where I knew there were two autistic teenagers sat either side of me. And there was a boy sat in front, and the boy in front had a learning disability and he was autistic. So his behaviour alerted people on the train to him being autistic and being neurodivergent and having a learning disability. One of the other people sat next to me was very anxious and autistic. Her behaviour, I think, probably didn't look like she was autistic and anxious. Her behaviour looked like she was probably quite a rude, inconsiderate person, if that makes sense. And I heard the people in the seat behind me talking about the autistic boy in front. And they had two autistic boys in front of them. But I think they were talking about the autistic boy sat in the row in front of us. And I was thinking about the affordances that we give in society when we understand something as different and when we don't see something as different. And for me, that was, I don't know why I'm sharing that story, but I'm just thinking, people's experience of being autistic will be different depending on how they're perceived in society and how they're understood as well. And they'll bring that with them to the therapy room. They'll bring the kind of stigma and judgments and things dependent on their varied lived experience, really, and how society responds to them and how society understands or supports them. When I completed my research, as Gail said, I spoke to mothers of autistic girls, and this was very much some of the kind of ideas that people had about autism. So, I just said it was typically boys quietly rocking in the corner, screaming and shouting. People who weren't able to sit on a carpet and listen and they just wander off. It's very much the kind of no eye contact and fiddling with small parts of cars. My perception was generally negative comments about it. Autism was not a good thing, and it was perceived by other people as not a good thing. And therefore, if you're autistic, you come with a not a good thing label. So this was the kind of early thoughts about autism for these mothers before their daughters were diagnosed. I have to say it changed quite significantly when their journey with their daughters changed, and they were able to see some of the strengths and unique things to celebrate about their daughters. So as we know more about autism, more people are being referred for an autism assessment or diagnosis. And I wanted to share this really because it's changing narrative at the moment. It was very much once autism is a childhood, and I'm going to quote this, disorder. And there was never really any thought to what would happen when an autistic person became an adult. We now have more and more autistic adults identifying as autistic, either because they're seeking a diagnosis or because they're identifying without a diagnosis, quite often following the diagnosis of one or both of their children or all of their children, because they're able to see some of their lived experiences in their children. What this means is that we've got a growing number of people with known diagnoses who are children beginning to become adults, and there's more of an awareness within services that we have autistic adults. We've also got an overrepresentation of autistic people in mental health services, in social care, in homelessness, in prisons, because we're beginning to understand more about presentations that we fit within the kind of diagnosis of autism. So it highlights why it's really, really important for us as therapists to understand more and know more about autism, and not to make it the special thing that some people work with. And I suppose that's the message I really want to share. This is not the special thing that some people should work with. This is the thing that everybody needs to know about, whether someone has a diagnosis or not. I'll probably keep reiterating that as we go along. But the diagnosis itself, I suppose we're at a turning point, and it's how people use or understand the diagnosis. And I've been involved in a piece of work with NHS England in the South East, where we've been looking at needs-led support for children and young people within schools due to huge delays for some people, where there's this kind of narrative that, well, they're struggling, let's see if they're autistic, we'll wait until they get their assessment and diagnosis and then we'll know what to do. But when you have really long waits for an assessment or diagnosis, does that mean a young person has to wait 2 years before they get the right support? So we're doing some work to look at how support can be front-loaded and needs-led rather than wait for a diagnosis or not. And actually, what parents ask for is maybe different from the diagnosis itself. The slide I'm sharing is a summary from a survey that was responded to by nearly 1,300 parents of autistic and neurodivergent children. And they said that really the primary concern they had, and the reason they were seeking a diagnosis for their child, was that they wanted them to have help with education and with school. And then it was around understanding and self-identification. But that primary concern was, I want support for my child. Likewise, when they were seeking an ADHD assessment and diagnosis for their child, it was for help with education and school. So if we are always front-loading autism diagnosis and assessment as the priority, what are we not doing as well? And I'm saying that knowing the benefit of a diagnosis, and I know that self-understanding is really, really important, but it's just thinking about, the journeys that people are on. And also, and I'm just going to leave this as a question, but how might the previous responses have differed if the question was put to adults about why they would be seeking a diagnosis? And then would it be, understanding myself would be at the top? Or would it be help with managing in the workplace or, higher education? So it's thinking about why people seek the diagnosis or the assessment in the first place as part of their journey. And we are in a turning point at the moment. We know there's huge waits for assessments. Mallet and Runswick Cole wrote a long time ago, and I think things have, become even more extreme than when they wrote it, about the commodification of autism, and I've added ADHD there as well. And there's just big business around it at the moment. Huge amounts of things, fiddle toys. If you go anywhere, you look at fiddle toys. T-shirts, stuff to buy, private practice. There's huge amounts of private practice, and there's a lot of money being made at the moment by people who are providing assessments and diagnosis privately. Huge amounts of books are being written. Things like weighted blankets and companies making all of these things, and so much. And I apologise for the jigsaw in the corner there as well, but that kind of any kind of accessories and stuff. I've put me on there as well because I've been paid to do a few presentations now, so I've become part of that kind of whole industry of money around autism and neurodiversity, and it's about whose benefit. We need to think about who's at the heart of all of this, really. And that impacts availability and demand as well. So I think we're going to end up with a really two-tiered system where people who can afford to have an assessment and diagnosis will have one, and those who can't afford to have one may not, or may be on longer waiting lists. So we're seeing that now. So I've put I've put a Cabbage Patch doll in the middle, because back in the day I remember there was a whole thing about, everybody wanted a Cabbage Patch doll, and the people who were able to go and buy their child a Cabbage Patch doll and travel around and everywhere got their child a Cabbage Patch doll, and those that couldn't didn't. And we're moving to a place with diagnosis that is potentially like that. And you will be working with families that are in different positions around whether there is an assessment or diagnosis available for their child, and how timely that will be as well. And that's going to impact their lived experience, their daily lives. And I suppose, and I've put this here, and I warned people it was a patchwork of ideas or a scrapbook of ideas. If we think about the narratives around autism, and the different ways of describing it, and I think this was mentioned at the beginning, really, some people will have autism and that's how they prefer to describe it. Some people will say, I'm autistic. But if you start to think about how that fits within the diagnostic narratives, we need to think then about how people can own it as well. So how can someone confidently say, I am an autistic person, without an assessment or diagnosis in place, if society doesn't give them the space to do that? So it's how do we support a society where we understand people are on long waits for assessment and diagnosis and can't necessarily have one, but they are still able to say, I identify as autistic, or someone who has autism if that's their preference, and validate that. We need to be able to validate that. And some of that will be in the therapy room as well when people come to see us. And actually, the diagnosis itself will only give part of the picture for that person. So the Centre for Attention and Learning and Memory in Cambridge, so this is described as the CALM study. They looked at the profiles of 1,000 children that either had an autism or ADHD diagnosis, both or no diagnosis. So they looked at the kind of unique profiles of these children. And what it showed was that diagnosis alone was not an accurate descriptor of the child's learning and support needs. And they really advocated for a child-centred approach, not a diagnostic-centred approach, when understanding support needs for children. So the diagnosis itself becomes sometimes the primary concern, and the uniqueness of the child beneath that, or the adult beneath that, sometimes gets lost, but we still need to be really mindful of that. So there might be themes that are similar, but there will be themes that are not similar, and it's how we hold those both in mind at the same time, the both and. But then that brings a challenge, and that's about observed versus experienced autism and the limitations of the diagnostic tools as well. But it's not just the limitations of the diagnostic tools, it's the limitation of the understanding from the people around a person. So with young people and adults who mask, so they're able to kind of go under radar with their autistic traits or behaviours. They can act like they fit in, but they don't necessarily feel like they fit in. So they're living that kind of dual world, really. And that has a big impact on self-compassion, and then potentially the ability to like who they are. And I'm going to reflect on this in a minute and think about what impact that has for young people that we might see in the therapeutic room, really. There's the impact of getting it wrong and the heightened anxiety about getting it wrong. And, there's research out there to show that this has potentially devastating consequences, because camouflaging and unmet support needs are, high risk markers in terms of suicidality in autistic adults. There's also the risk of misdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. So I was talking about the plane experience earlier, where one young person was behaving in a way that would be seen as very socially unacceptable, but wouldn't have been understood in the umbrella of autism and neurodivergence. It would have been labelled as, well, that person is being, rude or misbehaving, etc. And then that also has an impact on education and absenteeism from or within school, because people are struggling so much in school, but their needs aren't met and they're not understood. And I think Ruth's here. I'm sure I saw her name, which is fantastic. So that was Ruth's research, which is really worth exploring. And we do have traditional ideas of how behaviours ought to look. So this connects again with my plane example. So if you think about how anxiety ought to look, we think about breathing changes, short breath, looking worried and scared. So the picture here I've got of a young person looking very worried and scared, pale, avoiding things because they're anxious about them, maybe saying they're worried. Changes in heart rate and palpitations, being tearful, maybe being quiet, saying they're scared. And I just think, if you see that behaviour, what does that elicit in you? And just maybe a few words in the chat, if you see somebody behaving like that, what do you think you would do in response to that person? Especially if you're a parent or a teacher, what would you want to do? Yeah, you want to soothe them, yeah, and give them comfort, offer them care, reassurance. So it kind of elicits that kind of behaviour in you, doesn't it? So now imagine you see someone angry, aggressive, they're refusing to doing things, maybe they're damaging things, they're avoiding things, but in a very outward way, fighting, agitated, lashing out. What kind of behaviour does that elicit, do you think? Maybe, so now to be firm and assert control. Maybe some of you would have better understanding here, but how do you think others might respond? Yeah, triggering, angry, yeah, maybe fearful yourself. Yeah, okay, so it's a different response, isn't it? And actually, feeling anxious yourself then as well. So anxiety in ADHD and autism may look different, and actually we're talking about the same emotion underneath. So this child before was maybe experiencing the same feelings as this child after, but the behaviours that's elicited from the people around them is then very different. And what does that do to that individual when they're fearful? When I'm frightened, people come and they look after me and they comfort me. When I'm frightened, people get angry with me and they set boundaries on me, maybe hit me, but it's the same feeling beneath it. I'm going to jump past that one. So one of the things that the mothers that I spoke to in my research said was that when they understood their child was autistic, they changed their parenting. So they understood more about why their daughters were acting the way they were acting, and some of that outward displays of anxiety that was more around kind of meltdown, lashing out, etc. So they were saying that they'd kind of tossed parenting how they thought it should be aside, and they were forging their own path. And really that only really clashed when other people kind of tried to get them as parents to conform, really. Someone else said, I feel less pressure to conform because maybe there's an alternative, and also finding an alternative peer group of parents was really helpful. And then someone else said that the rules were off the table and then it changed the game. So that knowing is really helpful. So if, again, we hold in mind that the waits for an assessment is so long, how can we work with families to think about their child in the potential of autism and neurodivergence, so that they can still kind of work with those differences in a way that's kind of supportive, rather than elicit some of the other responses that we talked about. There's also a risk, I think, of when people do get a diagnosis, we end up with this diagnostic double bind, which some of the parents that I spoke to talked about. And again, it's just really helpful to be mindful of this when we're working with families. So there's that kind of wait to see if they're autistic, because then we'll do X, Y, Z. So, the potential autism is identified, but, support is delayed whilst waiting for the autism diagnosis. But then people were saying, you've got the official diagnosis. It's not as easy for people to fob you off. They've got a condition. They can't turn around and say no. So they're able to say, well, look, my child's autistic. Please, provide the support that before you said you won't, because we don't know. But then other parents were saying, well, now we've got the diagnosis for our child, we're told that they're not able to access that support because they're autistic or because they've got ADHD. So families are kind of split in this double bind. Your child needs to be autistic to get support. Your child can't have that support because it's not available to children who are autistic. I mean, it's so confusing if we think about kind of conflicting narratives. And this is what people are living in all the time. So I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to go back to old family therapy theory again. I'm sure a lot of you have, I've got it somewhere here, my John Burnham family therapy book from my family therapy training over 25 years ago. And he wrote, in family therapy, problems are viewed as parts of repetitive sequences of interaction which maintain and are maintained by the problem. And he said that practitioners using a systemic approach aim to identify and change the meaning and function of a presenting problem within the context of such a system. Okay, so this is what John wrote. And John was one of my supervisors on my doctorate and was my systemic brain all the time. When I started going off down kind of different routes, he would always bring me back and challenge me. He was fantastic. So hold that in mind and consider John's comments. Is autism the problem? And what is the impact on therapy if autism or ADHD is seen as the problem? What do you think? Don't know if people could write some comments. What do you think if autism or ADHD is seen as the problem? Somebody said therapy becomes individual. Therapy can become about changing the autistic person. Then we look to treat it, so we look to treat the autism. Responsibility is placed on the person with autism. The person is seen as the problem. It individualizes the problem into one person. Change becomes difficult. Yeah. It takes the diagnosis of the problem and doesn't consider anything else about the person. Thank you. That's all really helpful. And I think that's the risk, isn't it? And I think sometimes autism is seen as the problem, and therefore people feel they can't work with that family because there's nothing that can be changed. And people feel that that's, not something that's accessible, really. If autism or ADHD is seen as the problem, we risk reproducing in therapy experiences of stigma or othering, which people might experience in other contexts. Thank you. There's some really good comments there. Thank you. So I suppose the next part of what I want to talk through is just to help us think about how we work with families to hold autism in mind, but then also think about what else is happening, but also how they are experiencing life because of autism as well, really. So was thinking about hermeneutics, backshadowing, foreshadowing as one thing. So when we meet with people, there are different narratives about diagnosis within a family. People will have different stories about autism and what it means to be autistic or have an autistic family member. There'll be no one story. There'll also be an impact depending on when the diagnosis was. So sometimes if there's a diagnosis later, you'll work with families and they can look back on their experiences pre-diagnosis, but they're looking back with a new lens. They're now understanding the past in the context of autism, whereas they might not have done before. And that can be really helpful to explore. But then also there's the impact of foreshadowing and coping with the present. What if they don't manage school? What if they don't ever get married? What if they don't this? What if they don't that? So it's about what we can then do to help them think about the future as well, and not kind of shadow the future with the kind of, negative consequences that they think might happen, really. So it's really important to kind of explore all of these narratives and what autism as a diagnosis or ADHD as a diagnosis might play in that. And also to acknowledge that we've got the neurodiversity kind of movement. People are talking very positively about the strengths that autistic and neurodivergent people have, and we know there are many. But we also know that life can be really tough, especially for autistic young people. And it's really important to be able to understand that their experience may not fit with the positive neurodiversity narratives. And we've got to give space for that. You can't kind of go, oh, but it's great that you're autistic. No, that young person does not feel that being autistic is great. They want to be like their friends. They want to not have the stress and the anxiety that they experience. And you might meet young people where autism is awful. And we need to be able to hear that. We can't just move to, it's great. That there has to be space, and also for parents, because the risk is that we don't hear then, and we create kind of double masking in a way. And then other people it will be, oh, it's great, I understand who I am now, I understand why I never fitted in, it just makes so much sense, I've found my tribe, or a bit of both. I mean, Monday it might be great and Tuesday it might not be. So we need to hold all of those things in mind, really. And I spoke earlier about, this is really patchy, I told you it was a scrapbook of ideas, I'm really scrapbook of ideas. I was talking earlier about the way anxiety might present, and there's research that the amygdala may function differently in neurodivergent people, and there's been research around autism and the amygdala. And the amygdala is the kind of part of our system that it was kind of like the fear center. So in the brain, it's the fear center and the alarm system. So, if somebody comes around the corner with a banana, you go, oh my gosh, it's a gun. Oh no, it's not a gun, it's a banana. And you're fine. But with the amygdala, if it kind of gets triggered and doesn't function properly, and this happens with PTSD when there's extreme fear, the trigger impacts the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that forms new memories. And if it's thrown out, that's not able to function. And it also impacts the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that regulates our emotions and our decision making. And then we're unable to control responses. So if you think about when a young person or adult is in extreme meltdown and sensory overload, that part of the brain that does the thinking and the rationalizing isn't functioning in the same way that in a kind of a PTSD response, it doesn't function to kind of process things, really. If you think about that in the context of interactions, and if you think about a parent and a child interaction, for example, on the left here you've got the young person, so maybe the young person I showed earlier with those behaviours, at that moment in time, if they're in a sensory overload or meltdown, or they're experiencing distress, the internal part of their body, all of those kind of hormones and chemicals and everything flying around, is what's overarching and what's controlling. And the part of their kind of awareness that would be regulated by the prefrontal cortex, so, you know, decision making and controlling responses, is not working. It's much smaller, because the overarching bit at that moment in time is that fear center, the alarm system, sensory overload. That's how you are. If you think about the parent in that moment, most likely, and this is most likely because you can never say every system is, situation is the same, they are in a different place. They're seeing the behavior. So they're observing the distress behaviour or the acting out behaviour. And they will be thinking about stepping in to support that young person in one way or another, or to contain them, or to control them. And in that moment, their kind of internal processes are possibly even, their own internal processes are less, because they're stepping in. And that can then be experienced as a threat by the person, the young person, because at that moment in time, everything is a threat, everything is danger. They're unable to think through what's going on. So the person steps into control, but then what we have is kind of a lashing out, a hitting. I saw them, they were distressed, I went to help them, but they hit me. Why did they hit me? I was going to help them. What we potentially then get after is a flipping round. So afterwards, young people, they didn't want to hurt their parent. They didn't want to lash out to their parent or hurt their parent or their partner or whatever. The thinking part of their brain wasn't working. They weren't able to process that they were doing that. But they are now aware. They're hyper aware now that they've behaved in a way that they feel uncomfortable with and they feel bad about. And they maybe observe the distress now in their parent, or they're aware of what they did. Their internal processes are still quite high. It's still going on. But yeah, guilt, a lot of guilt. But then for the parent, sometimes there's a flip at that moment. They've been attacked now. They've experienced a threat. So their internal processes are the anxiety, the adrenaline, the emotional impact of what happened. And maybe less awareness then of the needs of the child, because they've been flipped over, if that makes sense. And what you can sometimes see then is the child will go to repair, but the parent is at a point where they need to withdraw to repair themselves. So then the child feels the rejection. And sometimes I think in family therapy, it's really helpful to work through some of these interactions so that people can see what's going on, but they can textualize it in the context of autism and neurodiversity, because sometimes it's helping parents not to step in at that early stage when actually that goes against their understanding of what you do as a parent. So it's back to that kind of doing it differently and helping them to do it differently. At points where these kind of things can happen, it's really, it's helpful to understand just things like transitions. So people think transition is when you finish primary school and go to secondary school, or you finish secondary school and go to college or whatever. Transitions can be going out the front door. They can be getting out of the car. They can be moving from upstairs to downstairs. And these kind of things are not understood sometimes as transitions, like moving from one environment to another environment, another task to another task. And these can be kind of quite difficult situations in a family day. And I think as therapists particularly, we need to understand that, because the journey that people go on in order to get to see us in a therapy room with their young children is huge. And I think if we are you know, somebody's 10 minutes late and it's like, well, they're 10 minutes late. You don't know what happened for them to get to you. And they probably need a medal that they got to you in the first place, to be honest, and a stiff drink. So it's understanding all of those things, really. Just the journey to come to us is huge. And, you know, all the experiences before. So I think, you know, we need to celebrate families that make it through the door. The other thing is about re-experiencing. So again, if you think about the way the brain works and the forming of memories and the amygdala, I've worked with a number of young people and young adults actually, and I remember talking to one young person about this in particular. When we were talking about anything that had happened before, it wasn't like, oh, I'm here now and I'm talking about this thing that happened then. It was talking about this thing that happened then makes me feel like it's happening now. I feel it again. All the feelings that I had are there again. So as therapists, we need to be mindful that our discussions about difficult things probably make us feel quite like the aggressor in a way, because we're bringing those feelings. And it's being really mindful of that and how we talk about that. And maybe talking about talking is really, really important. What's it like to talk about the things that happen to you? What can we do to support you with that? And really don't underestimate sensory processing and the impact of sensory processing on people's lived lives. Sensory processing in food is really important to be mindful of, especially because if you think about a child or a young person and a parent, one of the things you do as a parent is you feed your child and you give love through food. If a child doesn't eat the food you give them, then you feel they've maybe rejected your love. Also, if you keep trying to get a child to eat something that they feel really, harmful, then you're being experienced in a way that's harmful. And I remember talking to a young lady, she's in her 20s, about her mother's journey to understanding why she always needs the same spoon. And it was just so meaningful to her. The day her mum actually understood that, she was really important you have the same spoon. I'm the same, I need the same knife and fork, I don't like weird ones. So socks, barbed wire socks. If you're trying to get out of the house, if you think again about transitions, and this family are trying to get to you, but the socks that that their child is putting on feel like they've got barbed wire in them, and their parent is stressed because they're trying to get out the door with the child, but the child is stressed because the socks are really hurting their feet. It's huge, and the impact that has on people's lives is huge, and it's important to understand those things. And I've kind of put that there because it means there'll be different points in the day where there are huge amounts of anxiety for families because of transitions. Eye contact, we've talked, most people will know about eye contact. Yes, Marks and Spencer do sell good socks. I'll second that. Marks, eye contact is, we understand eye contact sort of stereotypically is that when someone's looking at you, then they're listening to you. For a lot of autistic people, when they're looking at you, they can't listen to you because they're working so hard to be looking at you. So it's about creating situations in which people can feel comfortable not to look at you, and that they're listening even though they're not looking at you. And sometimes that's about using techniques in the therapy room that actually divert gaze elsewhere, because it's quite intense sitting opposite somebody. I've put this down as an example of something that I did with one young person. I don't know if people have ever played Go Fish. It's like a card game where you put the cards upside down and you have to choose them. We did similar with Post-it notes. So I put all the questions I wanted to ask the young person on these cards, plus a load of other questions. And some of them were kind of difficult questions that would be hard to answer, and some of them were kind of everyday questions. And we put them upside down, and this is a young person with demand avoidant profile, autism and ADHD. And I invited them to lift up the card, read it, answer what what they felt comfortable to answer, and hand me the cards that they didn't feel comfortable to answer. And it's a small thing, but actually this is a demand avoidant young person, so they were given control over what they answered and what they didn't answer. We didn't have eye contact because we were looking at the cards and the table. And actually things that looked like questions that wouldn't give a huge amount of information, like the chocolate or crisps or McDonald's or KFC, gave huge amounts of information, because we ended up talking about food and sensory processing and family interactions around food. This wouldn't work with everybody. It's what we did on the day with that young person. So I suppose it's come up with what you think will work with the young person that you're working with. And this is what worked with them. And actually they answered every question. They answered the self-harm questions. They answered because we'd kind of mixed them all up, really. Whereas if I'd asked the same questions sat opposite them, I don't think we'd have got the same answers. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to flip through a few things. The other thing is, some families, it's very much about helping them understand what might be a trait as part of being autistic or ADHD, or what might be around sensory processing, and what's just their child, but also how these things all cross over as well. And I found sometimes just drawing it out on a big flip chart can be helpful, because I've worked with families where they just need to stop doing this. Well, actually they can't stop doing X, Y, Z, because that's part of being autistic. So it's helping families to kind of explore collectively what might be an autistic trait, or what might be ADHD, what might be sensory processing, and what's just them, what's just their likes and stuff. And actually you could end up just drawing a circle here where I've put Ben around the whole lot again, because actually it is all part of their child, but there's different bits that are maybe less in control and more in control. And another thing that has been really helpful in helping families talk about ADHD and autism in their families, I took from a workshop I went on with David Pentecost years and years ago. And I've always found this really helpful. And it was to ask families to bring in something that connected to autism. Well, with him it was ADHD, but I do it for autism as well. Bring in something that connects with autism or ADHD in their family, and to talk about it. And I've had some really interesting things brought in over the years, and actually sometimes it's been really telling. One young person brought in a bag of Haribo, and they said about how they brought Haribo in because their brother wasn't allowed to eat Haribo because he has ADHD, so his mum and dad didn't let him eat Haribo. And that was really touching, because it opened up a story about how she felt he didn't get to do some of the things he did. Someone else brought in a red t-shirt because they talked about seeing red and when they got angry. I've had parents bring in all of their EHCP paperwork. Young persons brought in their medication. So again, it's about opening up stories and narratives, and these differ in different families. And then back to family therapy theory. Structural family therapy. So sometimes having an autistic child or different numbers of autistic family members can have an impact on how families interact and the structure within families. So think about what patterns of interaction are there in the family, and what part does autism and neurodivergence play in this? What are the subsystems in the family, and has being autistic or neurodiversity played a part in how they have been formed and impacted? So I've seen families where maybe the mother aligns so much with the autistic child that the father then feels excluded, and then you end up with the kind of a flipping of relationships in the family. So what can you do to bring parents together so they're still like parental unit? So who's close and distant and when? And is autism playing a part in this? And does autism play a part in the family hierarchies? And is it that autism has the most power? And how can family relationships or even autism be reframed in a way that works better for the family? And there's a risk of diagnostic overshadowing as well. Sometimes it's, we work with families. There's a huge impact on that family of having, one of the children or both the children or 3 or 4, being autistic or parent, and how that impacts on daily life because of school and interactions and family, wider family and friends. And, we need to be curious about all of those things. But that doesn't mean that other stuff doesn't go on. And, sometimes underlying, we still have issues around, parents' relationships. There still might be, histories of domestic violence. There still might be all those other things as well. And the risk is that sometimes the curiosity stops at autism and then it doesn't go beneath. So we need to be curious about autism, ADHD, neurodivergence, but we can't stop there. We have to see other things too. Otherwise, we're doing a disservice to autistic young people who come to CAMHS, and we're doing a disservice to autistic adults that we see as well. Other stuff happens, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to work with that. So I think I need to stop because of the timing. So I'm going to stop sharing now and turn to Gail, and I'll leave the revisiting autisms on the slides. Does that make sense, Gail? Because you want to do groups, don't you?
Yes, that's great. Thank you so much, Mary. I've got lots of questions myself. The double diagnosis overshadowing stuff in the last slide was also of particular interest to me. We're going to put you into small breakout groups just for 10 minutes in order for you to just talk with each other about some of your responses, so that we can come back together for the last 15 minutes before the break, and you can put any ideas, questions you have to Mary for Mary to respond to. So you might find it helpful, or others might find it helpful, if you can at least introduce yourself very briefly. Just say your name, at least put your camera on while being in the going into breakout rooms, so people know who they're talking with. If you don't want to join a breakout room, don't join it. Do whatever you need to do. So we'll meet back here in about 10 minutes at 11:15. You'll need to look for a button on the screen saying join. And as I say, join or don't join. So, Mary, everybody's been in the breakout rooms. Are we ready to hear some responses from people? So people, please maybe unmute yourself. I'm going to try and see how I can see people. Unmute yourself and either jump in or put your hand up, and hopefully I'll see you. But just any responses, thoughts, reactions. There was lots of animation in the chat, lots of connecting. Are there any things you disagree with? Any other complementary points of view that might be interesting to float? People have unmuted themselves. So Tammy, go ahead, please, Tammy.
I was talking about maybe my own lived experience as a neurodiverse person, and being diagnosed in my early 20s. I found like a sense of safety when I would come across other neurodiverse people, and part of that safety was kind of assuming that their neurodiversity acted or worked in a similar way to mine, and that led to a few misunderstandings. And I feel like I was really reminded about that and earlier in this presentation, and I'm currently in the process of unlearning the kind of assumption that, oh, they don't probably also like bright lights, which I learned recently that no, some people do not like bright lights and hate it. And just as a silly example, but kind of just knowing that even though I understand my own neurodiversity very well, I do not know anything about the individuals. And yeah, kind of just working through that.
That's a really helpful reflection. Thank you. And I think that plays out in families as well, because you can have neurodivergent people within a family who are all very different and have different needs, and that can sometimes be quite hard for families to manage, because it's understanding that even though you've got the umbrella term, that your needs are very, very different, and it's how to allow space for that and understanding for that as well. But it's a really helpful reflection. Thank you.
Somebody else. What was happening in the breakout rooms? What were some of the themes?
So someone's talked about cultural awareness and the difference in cultural expectation about eye contact. And that's a really helpful point as well, isn't it? Because I think in different countries, like Korea, for example, if a young person holds eye contact with an adult, it's thought of as rude. So things that we actually put within our diagnostic criteria for eye contact, for example, you score 2 automatically on an ADOS, but in different cultures, not holding eye contact would be considered acceptable and the right way to interact, rather than something that would be seen as sort of divergent and different. It's a helpful point.
What other discussions were going on? Carol's asking a question. I wonder if you disclosed your own neurodivergence to clients, colleagues, and how that potentially changes any dynamic or approach to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And I think I had a really negative experience very early on when my daughter was first diagnosed. I was working with a family, and I was still it was all new to me. And I shared about, because it happened to be a mother I have epilepsy. It happened to be a mother with epilepsy with a neurodivergent daughter. And I was sat there with epilepsy with a neurodivergent daughter. And I shared something, and it was so wrong to share at that moment in time. For me, because I was still learning about what everything meant to me. And this woman didn't want me to have the same story as her, because she was sat where she was sat and I was sat where I was sat. And it wasn't helpful. And I've found that over the years I've disclosed less, but used my experience to inform my questioning more. Although the other day, I was with a young person the other day, because I'm slightly double jointed on my arms, and we were, playing around with different things and making connections. And rather than sort of say I was autistic, I mentioned, you can tell we're all neurodivergent in this room, can't you? But it was just that. And with another family, I've not mentioned it at all. So I think you've just got to be really careful what you share and how you share. But I think in some contexts, it's more shared in an understanding of how you're talking about things and understanding things, rather than naming it. I don't know if that answers that question or not. It might be a bit of a rambly answer, but I think it really varies. But I would err on not sharing rather than sharing in the context of working as a therapist within CAMS, for example.
It's interesting what people want from conversations when they come to a service, when they come to see a therapist or some kind of practitioner, because some people want to know you're listening, and they just want listening, and they don't actually care who you are and what your experience is. They want something, or they want to feel that there's something in progress that they feel is going to arrive where they need it to arrive. For example, with a referral for a diagnosis, or interaction around advice. But sometimes people need to feel understood. And that's maybe, I think, where sharing can come in, and one can always qualify it with, and I don't know if you do that, Mary, with, my experience will still be different to yours nevertheless. But there's been a lot of moral judgment implicit, I think, in the psychotherapies around not sharing over time. But that's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about what's useful and what's a good fit. How would you respond to that? That's me talking, actually, from my experience of being a queer person working in a queer therapy practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point you made is people need to feel heard, and that's the important thing. And I think the risk is if you share too much, you can start to not feel like you're hearing anymore, but you're doing the talking. Does that make any sense? So, like I said, I think it really varies. I err on not, but I use my lived experience in the questions and the understanding that I share with people. Yeah, I think it depends. It really does depend. That's the thing, isn't it? It depends who you're meeting and who you're with and what is right at the time.
And Adele Vida's asking, interesting to hear about no rules. What happens when drugs are taken? And sorry, it's just jumped off my screen. When drugs are taken, overspending occurs with a young adult. And in addition to that, Jennifer's added no rules and no boundaries and low demand are all different things. Relational first, boundaries important. And Claudia's added, I like your question, Adele, because it poses a real dilemma around safety and implications for others and harm for self. So any thoughts, responses to that, Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I think low arousal doesn't mean no rules and no boundaries. And I think rules and boundaries are really important. And I think young people can feel frightened if they feel there's no structure around them. But it's having that knowledge about what it's no rules and no boundaries isn't necessarily reflected in terms of not stepping in when someone's having a meltdown, for example. You can still have rules and boundaries, you can still have structure. People need structure in their lives, but maybe it's not forcing people to do things that they really can't because of their neurodivergence. And that's where you start to have that kind of flexibility. And it's really hard for families to know, where am I pushing my child against something that I really can't push them against? And where am I not putting a boundary in where actually there needs to be a boundary? And that's part of the journey when we work with families, isn't it? It's working out where, I've worked with families where suddenly there's been no boundaries. And, you've got children who are crying out for boundaries because they really need them. And sometimes it's kind of reining it in again and helping families to think about, which battles are the ones they need to fight in terms of boundaries. And again, it's that journey, isn't it? It's that relational journey and exploring the pattern that's got things to where they've got to. So working with one family where, a parent who had a really strict background didn't want to be strict with their children, and then their child's autistic and they've gone to the point of having no boundaries at all, and that's been really destabilizing for the young person. So helping bring that kind of history into the room. So why is there no boundaries, and what does that mean to you? What was your experience of being parented? And then what is your experience of being a parent and parenting your child? And what part does autism play in that? But also what part does your own background and history play in that? So it's bringing all of those things into the room, isn't it? There's no easy, you should do X, Y, Z, because nobody's a blank sheet, are they? Everybody brings their lived experience and the oughts, how they think they ought to parent and how they think other people think they ought to parent. And it's bringing all of that into the mix, isn't it?
Just before we go into a break, maybe one more point from the chat, but actually an invitation to everybody to, as Monica mentioned at the beginning, we have hosted tea breaks. We have live tea breaks and lunch breaks where you can stay connected and carry on the conversation. David Steers asking, is ADOS acceptable for systemic practitioners to use?
Depends what they're using it for. I mean, ADOS is an assessment tool for autism that's got people have got their own views on ADOS, and it's primarily a tool that was developed around the assessment of boys, for example. If you're working with a family therapeutically, there would be no reason for you to be using an ADOS.
We've got
if you're a diagnostic clinician, then
Right.
there might be. But even then, you would need to do it with caution about its limitations.
That might be something to discuss in one of the systemic therapy community forums that we've got structured into the program. I can't remember when it is, but there's one on what should we be doing as systemic practitioners. I think it's the very last one on Friday, tomorrow afternoon. But Mary, let me just thank you for really stretching, informative, and practically useful as well as theoretically rich presentation set of ideas. Thank you so much. And uh, really enjoyed that. I'm sure everybody else did. Could you please can we just do something different? Like put those twinkly things on one screen. Hibak's managed to get a sparkling heart up. Other people have got the yellow clapping hands. But you can also, people, just unmute yourselves for a minute and just make a noise, say thank you.
Woo!
Yeah. Well done, Nikki.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. That's lovely. That's
Thank you.
Techno human voices. Thank you again, Mary. That was wonderful. Please, people, if you want to stay on, if you want to take a break, we'll be meeting back at 11:30 for the next session of short presentations. Let's start on time for that. But stay in the tea break if you want. Carry on the conversation. Thank you again.